So welcome everybody to today's panel discussion. Thank you all for joining us for the first of the year BioStrategy Partners Practical Knowledge Series. And today's topic I'm very excited about today's topic, which I'm trying to advance the slides. Here we go. So today's topic will be about startup basics and the current state of biotech startup and some aspects of the intellectual property. Before we start, I'd like to kind of explain what BioStrategy Partners is. We're a nonprofit consortium of academia institutions that help translate technologies into the marketplace. We do this through a couple of different mechanisms, one of which was the Moderator program, which we help connect academia labs to our industry partners so that they can help fund early stage technologies to de-risk that technology so that they can potentially license it in the future. The other program that we offer is the Kiz Tax Credit Program. So if you reside in a specific zone in Pennsylvania, then you're eligible to apply for up to $90,000 of tax credits for the year. So if you're interested in any of these programs and more information about Practical Knowledge Series, please contact me at brian.chow@biostrategypartners.org. I'm very happy to give you more information on that. So next, I'd like to thank our sponsors for hosting the event today. We have a representative, Pat Kelly from Stradley, Ronon. I'd like to thank CBRE, as well as our new sponsor, NVM Associates, and our old sponsors as well, Silverstein Properties, Cantor Fitzgerald, as well as University Place Associates. So thank you, sponsors, for hosting the event. Next, I'd like to introduce our moderator, who is Erika Swift, the president of BioStrategy Partners, and also operation directors at Center for Medical Innovations at Penn State College of Medicine. And very excited to hear her speak today, as well as moderate the panel. She's a very experienced individual in her field, and she's also been acting as a sort of mentor to myself. So I'm very excited to see her speak today. And with that said, Erika, I'll just leave it to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Brian. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we kick off our 2022 BioStrategy Partners Practical Knowledge Series. We're actually going to be starting this year by addressing some of the questions innovators face after they generate intellectual property. And we will explore what you can expect and what considerations you should really consider as you're advancing intellectual property, whether it's from research to proof of concept all the way to a commercializable technology. But I do want to note that many of the topics that we're going to be touching upon today are going to be explored in depth throughout the year, including like how to identify and obtain funding, the importance of customer discovery, and the advances of strategic partnerships and how to make them. So those are just a few of the things that will be discovered. We'll explore more in depth later out through the year. But before we dive into our discussion today, I would like each of our panelists to just take the opportunity to introduce themselves. So Matt, would you kick us off and give an introduction?
Sure. My name's Matt Handel. I'm the CEO of Express Cells. We're a biotechnology company. We do genetic engineering as a service. We're a spin out of Temple University, about 3.5 years old at this point.
Oh, thanks so much, Matt. Carlos?
Thank you, Erika. Hello, my name is Carlos Barrero. I am MD by training, and I am an assistant professor at the Temple University School of Pharmacy for the last 3 years, but I have been in Temple for 15 years, and I have a lot of interactions with the technology transfer. I have 7 patent applications, of which 3 has been already issued to Temple.
Wow, very cool. All right, and Pat, will you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Pat Kelly. I'm a patent attorney with Stradley Ronon. I've been working as a patent attorney in the city for 30 years, working with a variety of startups and existing larger pharmaceutical companies.
All right, thanks, Pat, and thanks for being with us today. All right, so we're going to set the stage and discuss what an academic inventor will encounter when they generate intellectual property, and what do they need to consider, and what resources are available to them. Carlos, you have a lot of experience in this space. So will you, kind of address this, as an academic inventor?
Yes, I think one of the major considerations is especially, for example, for me in the last 3 years that I got into the tenure track, is balancing how to get funding and how to protect your ideas before publishing or putting your data outside for the scientific community. Then there is always for us like a pressure of publishing or getting this grant funding for keep our research going. But we also, the idea of all our research is to develop new knowledge, and then we have to balance. We have to have some projects that are going to be centered for intellectual property and some other projects that can be develop new knowledge and get funding independently, because each of the process will take a long time, and if we only go from one of them, then we cannot move forward in all the other aspects. And I think that's my first initial like advice. Keep several different lines of projects, and some of them are going to have as an outcome developing some kind of intellectual property, something that is functional, valuable, or is innovative.
Oh, thank you for Carlos. I think that is a really good point, and I think that's something that academic inventors really do struggle with is how do you manage protecting intellectual property, but then also obtaining grants and publishing. So those are really great points. Now, there's definitely a timing aspect to this, and as inventors, especially the inventors that are new to the patenting process and the patent application process, they may very well be unfamiliar with the patent timeline. So Pat, I'm going to turn to you at this time. Can you share with our audience kind of that patent process? What should they expect as far as how long is this going to take, and is there even milestones along the way?
Sure. So I think there's always this pressure to publish when you're an academic researcher. So one thing you want to explore is your relationship with the tech transfer office. So they'll understand you want to publish, but they also want to protect any useful IP. So the normal process is to have an initial discussion with your tech transfer office, and if they decide a technology is something that should be protected, they'll probably reach out to Patent Counsel to have what's called a provisional patent application drafted. And a provisional patent application is kind of a marker in the ground that says on this date I filed an application. So you would speak with a patent attorney, explain the invention. The patent attorney would then work to prepare an application, usually by first drafting a set of claims that would describe and protect the thing you think is the invention. And I would encourage inventors to speak with their patent attorney so the attorney understands what it is you're selling, what would eventually potentially go out the door as a product, for example. And once they have that understanding, draft the claims accordingly so they protect what you're selling. Because the purpose of a patent application, it's a commercial document to allow you to sue somebody for infringing. It's not an academic paper. They're two different things. And so once your attorney understands that, they can draft the application, the so-called provisional. And then I believe you've pulled up the chart, Erika, that shows then some deadlines start to come into place. So within 12 months, you have to convert that provisional application into a regular application. And you can file a series of provisionals after your first provisional. So you could actually file a series of provisionals as you go and then combine them all into one filing within that 1 year deadline. During that 1 year period after the filing of the provisional, the tech transfer office and the scientist should first say, do we feel free to publish now because we have the provisional on file? That may be the motivation for filing, or one of the motivations for filing the provisional. It also gives us scientists to do more experiments to support the concept, perhaps provide other aspects of the invention. And importantly for the tech transfer office as well as the inventors is find potential partners that would finance the patent process, because it can be very expensive, especially when you get into international filing. So as you can see in the timeline, eventually the application is published, so it's going to be made publicly available. And then you can enter within 30 months of that priority date what's called a national phase. So if you file what's called a PCT application, it allows you to pursue the invention in a variety of different countries. In fact, almost every country you would care to worry about. And within that 30-month date, you can then start to enter individual countries and file for patent protection in those countries. So most people will file a provisional followed by a PCT and a US, or they'll file the PCT and go into the US during that so-called national phase. But the idea is to provide for protection around the world, potentially, if it's an important invention. And with regard to that, you want to ask yourself too, is your invention very narrowly focused, or is it, say, what you might consider a platform technology, like the laser or a PCR? Is it something like that that really devotes real funding and real international protection? Also, when you're thinking about the business model for your company, are you interested in international protection? In other words, if you're going to go out and maybe, you want to have a big pharma, say, pick up the case, they're probably going to want international protection because they're all around the world. So you need to kind of plan your patent strategy along with your model for what your company will eventually become. So those are kind of the big marks as to what you need to be paying attention to.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that very detailed explanation of the process. Before we turn to Matt to speak from a business perspective, we did receive a question from the audience. And the question was, what is the difference between like a provisional patent and a pending application? Can you just speak to that?
When you file a provisional, you've basically established a date. So other folks that come along later and invent can't say they came up with the invention before you did. So it's basically a marker in the ground. Mm-hmm. When you file the application, then you can say you have a pending patent application. The idea is to put the world on notice that you filed an application and there's a potential that they could be sued down the road if you get the case allowed and there is infringement.
Erika, I would like to make, before you turn to the commercial part, couple of more points before even the provisional patent application. There is, like, as a scientist, we are always too focused in a specific problem or a specific matter that we are trying to deal, and we are always in a rush to publish it or to present it in an international conference or things like that. Then one of the points that Pat mentioned to get into contact with the technology transfer office is very important. Even if you are not sure if what you have can be considered as an intellectual property, then one of the things is to have this close relationship with your technology transfer office and give them, send them an email, call them, or interact with them to see if what you are going to disclose outside to the scientific community can have some sort of value or patentability. Then that's one of the most important things as like in keeping in mind in creating new intellectual property, because sometimes you are so focused that you cannot envision that the findings that you are getting can be applied for some other kind of disease or another applications that can be patent. And once you start disclosing this or putting this in the public knowledge, then it will lose any completely value. Then you can even submit a document that is before the patent application, submit that in through the invention disclosure, that is like internal communication to the from your lab to the technology transfer office, and they will advise you if how to proceed. If that is enough, if you're finding innovative, you have something new, or that cannot be patents, and then you get like the feedback from them.
Carlos, I will say you just warmed my heart so much with those commentary, because that is something, yes, that, being, associated with tech transfer and trying to commercialize intellectual property from an academic institution, that is something that is so challenging at times, especially when you sit down with a faculty member and a researcher and they've come up with some wonderful intellectual property, but then we find out they've already published on it, they've already disclosed it, and now we've lost the ability to protect it. So yes, we welcome and always encourage all of our researchers to meet with us early. And it may be too early to file that provisional patent, but we can be working in that partnership, and having those strategies. I really liked your comment too about even identifying that indication. so their research may take a different path than they were originally thinking because there's an industry need. So thank you. Those are fantastic comments. All right, so I want to turn to Matt now, because you have a different perspective coming from, the serial entrepreneur and the business world. So when you're looking at, intellectual property, what are some of the things that are really important to you through this process of provisional to filing the patent application?
Well, Erika, you brought up a good phrase, industry need. And I think that's something we all have to pay attention to when we are looking at intellectual property. You've all probably heard the phrase, not every patent is valuable and not every valuable idea is patentable. That's the way that we will often look at it. So a good example is if you're working on a new therapeutic. Sometimes a very small innovation, you take an existing compound, you change one atom in it, and suddenly it's much more efficacious. That's very valuable, even if it's a small change. And then there's some great leaps forward that just can't be commercialized. So we're often asking the question, where's the value? And think of the value falling into two categories. What's the value to an investor, and what's the value to a customer? Because I'm glad you have the chart up about provisional, PCT, et cetera. As you move through the process, the patent to an investor becomes more valuable because you pass several hurdles. If you get a positive report from the international authorities, that's great. If you get a response from the patent office, the US Patent Office, and I know Pat will talk more about this, they'll say you're rejected, but if they tell you how to fix it, that's another bit of value as well. So we look at it that way. The other thing we look at is, as you said, Erika, industry need. If it's a therapeutic, is it an area that's highly unsatisfied? If it's a process or a service, is it providing a significant advantage over what's currently out there? And that's the way we often approach things. The one other point, the one that Carlos made, is really about publishing versus patenting. Ultimately, we usually want both. But the patent is very important usually for getting your funding. The publication will be great for commercialization. And that's the order it'll generally come in. You need investment to build a company before you can commercialize.
Thank you, Matt. All right, and I'm going to open this question up to the entire panel, whoever wants to jump in first. So, the one question we'll get from some inventors is like, well, once you have a patent application or you have a pending patent or even an issued patent, is that the end all and be all? Or is there opportunity to even file follow-on IP or additional IP that's more supportive and creating more value around a concept in intellectual property?
I can go. There's tremendous value. It depends on the circumstance, but there are different types of patents. If you're working on a therapeutic, for example, there's composition of matter for the actual compound itself. There may be use patents for use in certain indications. There may be a process patent that protects how you create that. Now, some of them are better than others. I'll defer to Pat on that one, but it doesn't hurt to have more usually. I mean, there's a trade-off. It costs money. For anyone who's not yet worked with patent attorneys, I can tell you that good ones do not come cheap. And really excellent ones are far, far, far from inexpensive. But generally, you want to build not just one patent, but a patent family.
Yeah, just to follow up with some very simplified examples. So let's say Matt mentioned the composition of matter versus, say, a process. So I might have a claim to a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's that way I could sue people that have basically my peanut butter and jelly sandwich if they don't have a patent. But I could also have a claim to a method of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and that claim isn't necessarily as valuable because you could put peanut butter on one piece of bread and jelly on another in my claim, but there may be people that put peanut butter and jelly on at the same time, or they buy that peanut butter and jelly that comes together in one squeeze dispenser. In other words, there's workarounds. So ideally, you'd like to get a composition of matter claim, although there can be value to the the methods you make it. For example, there might be ways to make something that's incredibly efficient and cost effective versus other ways for something to be made. So you mentioned, you know, additional patents. So for example, if you come up with a composition of matter that's, say, useful for treating a stuffy nose, so that you'd have a composition of matter for the pharmaceutical, but then you might have a application directed to a device for administering it. So maybe there's a special device used to administer it, or there's a special method process for making the composition of matter itself. So how it's manufactured. There might be claims to go after even for methods of use, how it's used, different indications. And then, of course, you always want to keep your mind up to improvements. So, you know, most inventions aren't static. By the time you're filing or converting the provisional into a regular application, usually there's been improvements, and you want to see if there's an approach to take to get coverage for those. The issue you may have is once, let's say, you've published on your invention after you file the provisional, you have to look out there and see what art is now going to be a problem for you in convincing the examiner that the invention is novel. So there are challenges, but it's always something you should consider doing. Most large patent estates are based on, you know, subsequent improvements.
And can I add one thing to that? And that's something that often you need more than just an academic lab for. You know, I like your example, Pat, of you know, a compound to treat nasal allergies, but also the delivery device. You know, if you think of how academia is usually set up, you may have a medicinal chemist working on the original drug, but it may be an engineer who's working on the delivery device. So that either can be across labs within an institution, or that's when you form a company, you need to bring in the right people to build additional IP.
Very good point, Matt.
Erika, I don't know if you are going to have this in a follow-on question, but from my perspective, we have experience doing like related patents. Some of them are like, for example, the composition of matter for a specific disease or condition that later on we can identify a different, completely different disease in which have the same underlying mechanisms, and then we can use this composition of matter to patent for that specific disease. Then this will apply and create some additional patents around that composition of matter. That is one example. And the other example that I can give you is when we put together a patent application, we have several claims, and then we get a response from the patent office saying that some of the claims are like accepted and some of them are declined. Then we has been able also to take these claims that were finally declined after we respond and try to get more information and fill a new patent around that other claims when they are solidified.
All right. So you made a lot of really great points there. We did get a couple questions in from the audience. I'm going to hold those aside because I want to tease out some of the comments that you made there, Carlos. So one being those different indications. And I think that's something that we do experience quite a bit where, you know, a researcher's body of work, you know, and the preclinical studies are for a particular indication and a patent is filed on that. But as their work continues, or even as they start to engage someone like Matt and they're looking at the business opportunity, you actually find out that that technology can be applicable and really address a market need for an indication that doesn't have a really viable solution. So I thought that was, you know, and that gives you then the opportunity to pursue that follow-on IP as you do those follow-on preclinical tests. So I thought that was a fantastic example. The other piece you started to pull upon was getting that patent examiner's response. So I actually want to talk about that a little bit before we turn to the audience questions that are coming in. So, you know, and having experienced that myself with researchers, you get this negative response from the USPTO patent examiner where they're basically, nope, you can't have any of these claims. And, you know, and it's very it's very disheartening. I'll say that. But I loved when we were talking earlier, Pat, you were like, that's not a bad thing to get a negative response. So Pat, can you share with the audience, why is a negative response not necessarily a bad thing?
Well, when I started getting trained back in the dark ages, attorney was training me, said, if you get a first office action allowance, you're in trouble, which means I probably claim the invention too narrowly. So one of the things you have to do when you're drafting a case is balance, the breadth of the claims with reality. So you want to claim as broadly as you can, but not so broadly that it's either not going to get through prosecution or it's going to be unenforceable, or both. So you want to find a nice balance that covers your invention and allows you to stop people from doing workarounds. And usually when you draft a case like that, an examiner is, like, I'd say 9.9 times out of 10, the first office action, substantive office action, when they've examined the claims and searched the prior art, is you will get rejections, usually on novelty and usually on obviousness, oftentimes both. And that's just normal. So my advice is just to tell the client to expect that. When it happens, take a deep breath and then read the art cited by the examiner, because a lot of examiners, they have a lot of cases they're looking at. They have favorite art they always go to. So there's like they're in examining groups, which means they focus on cases that are very similar all day long, and they tend to use certain pieces of art over and over again sometimes. That's not guaranteed, but it's common. And what you should do is sit down and actually read the prior art that's cited, and then start to think about reasons why it's not relevant or it doesn't really apply or cover your invention. And once you've had a critical reading of the cited art, set up a meeting to speak with a patent attorney so you can work together to figure out how to argue either the art isn't relevant, or you can amend your claims in a way to still protect your invention, but eliminate that art as evidence of novelty, lack of novelty, or that it's obvious. So you just want to spend time with the attorney to see what are the arguments I can make that my invention isn't obvious and it still is novel, based on what the invention is versus what the examiner says it is, because oftentimes the examiners don't quite understand exactly what you're doing, which leads to another recommendation, and that is always try to consider getting an interview with the examiner. When you're speaking to somebody, it's the conversation can go in directions very easily that it can't go in when I'm just sending you a letter saying you're right, you're wrong, you're right, you're wrong, which is kind of the way some patent prosecution looks. But if you actually get an examiner on the phone and understand what the examiner is thinking, sometimes you'll see that the examiner is looking at the invention in a fundamentally different way from the way you do. And inventors are very deferential, I think, to not so much to patent attorneys, but to the inventors. And if you have a discussion with the patent examiner, you can sometimes find a way forward that you won't find if you're just filing only written responses.
I can give a real life example about that. So for our initial patent, we were going back and forth with the U.S. Patent Office. They sent a response. I remember it was October of 2020. And of course, it was another rejection. That's the way it's always phrased, as Pat put it. And I spoke to our IP attorney to say, what do you think? And he was really happy, because he basically said, okay, they basically said we can't grant it. And then they said bad things about all of our claims but one. And he said, that's code. He's okay with that claim. So we resubmitted with just that one claim, and we got an allowance very, very quickly. So you really do need to know how to read these. And again, that's why you need a good patent attorney.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, and the one thing I always thought was very interesting, and I didn't have a full appreciation of, is, and Pat, you mentioned this earlier, you can also take this as an opportunity to actually, obtain competitive intelligence, because sometimes the patent examiners will alert you to other publications you may not have been aware of, or other patents that are out there that you may not have been aware of that are in this space, that you can actually use that information on how you're going to strategically decide to move forward. Is there any additional thoughts about that?
Well, first, the competitive intelligence. I mean, don't look at a bad office action as a negative in the initial views. Think of it as, well, here's what I need to do to toughen this thing up, to harden it, to get it through, including when it might be litigated. But also, what else are people doing out there? As you start to read the art cited, you may realize I hadn't thought of that approach or that interpretation of how this thing works or whatever. The other thing is it may identify potential people that might want to be looking to you for a license. So you may start to understand who's out there in the corporate space, in the big world, that actually has interest in this type of technology. And it could also be an opportunity to identify competitors and partners at the same time. So think of it as a very useful exercise from a variety of perspectives, not just, oh no, the examiner won't let me have my patent.
You know, and the point about competitive intelligence is very important. You shouldn't, I spoke earlier about a patent has value. Well, value is relative. You know, if you filed IP and your competitors have also filed IP, you need to have a realistic view of what the value of your IP is versus theirs. And you also need to make sure that you're not both trying to go for the same thing.
Erika, I would like to add from the academic perspective, like when we receive these comments from the patent office, it's exactly the same feeling as when we receive the comments from the reviewer, be in our grant application or in our paper that we are trying to publish. Then there is a lot of mixed feelings there. You have to let it cool down, and then you have to go back and take, as Pat was mentioning, one by one, because many of them can be addressable. Then they can be wrong, and then, as Pat was saying, they can have a different idea of what you are trying to say, and it's only an opportunity to improve. Then it's same as a review process. It just get better and better, and then you have the opportunity to improve your application or even to make a different claim, as I was mentioned before, with things that are not included at the ideal strategy is, as Matt mentioned, take whatever is positive, go ahead with that, and then take the remaining and make it even better, and then give it another chance. But always you have to fight back, because the reviewers always say, like, this is not novel because you have A and B, and then anyone can think if you put these two together is equal to C. And it's not the case. You have to have the know-how in order to make that combination.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. And it's a great analogy comparison, to your grant review or your publication review. I know all of our, academic faculty and researchers can relate to that. All right, I do want to address some questions that came in from the audience. So the first question is can you talk about when is the best time to pursue a patent?
Well, I mean, there's no perfect answer to that. I guess the best time is if you really are, if you're an academic researcher and you want to publish, you probably need to get something on file. The patent office, get a provisional application on file. But it could be a situation where there's no plan to publish anytime soon. You're still working on the invention. If you don't think there's competitors hot on your trail, you may have some time. So there's no perfect answer to that. I think it's a balance of competing interests. Like, if you don't file and someone beats you to the punch, that's a big problem. Or if, when I started, I'd get a notice that somebody was going to do an abstract that would be released whenever. The problem is now we're in the world of the internet. And, people do poster presentations and they don't really pay attention to what's on the poster. And suddenly, someone snaps a picture of it. It's all over the world, not to mention everybody at that meeting. It's considered a disclosure. So information moves a lot faster nowadays. So my advice is talk to your tech transfer office. Say, I have an invention, I do want to publish or I don't. There's a competitor or there isn't. You just make them aware of the whole, give them situational awareness as to what the issues can be, as to how quickly that information might flow out into the public, so they can help you decide when is the best time to file a case. They don't want to be filing cases every 5 minutes because they don't have a budget for that. But if you work with them well, they can help advise you as to, like, this is a good time to file. So, and provisionals don't have to be that expensive. But again, you don't want to go through the exercise unless it makes sense. But my best advice to that is there is no perfect answer. Talk to the tech transfer office, make them aware of the concerns about the invention being disclosed, and they'll work with you to figure out the best time to file.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, speaking from, being inside the academic institution and working with innovative researchers, I would wholeheartedly agree with everything you've said. I think just coming and talking with us early, and then we can work together to identify what is the best time to file. And sometimes, we will file a provisional patent application because we think there's a pending public disclosure. But then if it turns out that you as a researcher, you end up not holding that publication for a little bit while, we can always abandon that provisional and refile. So it is something that we do look at quite a bit. We do try to strategize with the researcher on when is the best time to file. But the biggest thing is we just need to know and be working with you. So yes. All right. The next question that came in is, can you talk about ways to fund the patenting process? So I think there's two different segments here. I think you have one inside the academic institution, but then once the IP leaves the academic institution, then that changes. So does anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I can do after it leaves the academic institution, but maybe we should have the inside go first.
Okay, from my perspective, like the technology transfer, do this analysis when you submit the inventor disclosure, and they consider if it's worth it, the time and the resources that need for pursuing the patent application. Then the university is going to take responsibility for all the costs, and basically you are as a scientist or as a researcher, you only are responsible to complete the information that is needed for the application. Then the university will take full responsibility. And from my understanding is that during this process of for the patent to get completely issue, the university is actively seeking for like an industry partner that can license this patent, because the whole process is becoming expensive over time. Then the provisional patent application can be really cheap, but after that there is like a international patent application that are really expensive. And then the industry, the university is always seeking to connect with the industry to be able to like caution this expensive. But that's from my experience what I can give from the academic side.
Okay.
And I'm going to jump in here before we turn it over to you, Matt. So Carlos, you were spot on. So I'm going to answer the question of why the academic institutions actually will go through all of the expense of the patenting process. And we're mandated through the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. So that was, legislation that came through that really encouraged and mandated that and gave intellectual property back to the universities. So the federal government is putting a lot of money into academic institutions to develop research, which does lead into intellectual property. But one thing that they're asking, back of the academic institutions that they're funding is when intellectual property is generated, that you actively protect it and try to commercialize it. So that's one reason why tech transfer exists, and all of these offices within academic institutions work with researchers that are developing intellectual property, is because our federal government is mandating that we do so through this Bayh-Dole Act. So to give you a little policy lesson there. So I'll turn it over to you, Matt, to talk about the outside.
Sure. So once you're ready to spin it out, there are a number of ways you can do it if you're an academic. And this is, by the way, when you should be working very closely with your tech transfer office, because there are pros and cons to every approach. One approach is for the university to license it to an already existing company. That could be a small company or it could be large. If you think, for example, with CAR-T that eventually was partnered with Novartis. Now, Novartis is a huge multinational. They have plenty of money. They're probably managing dozens of patent applications at any given time in a number of markets. At the same time, they're a big company. As an academic, you may probably not have a lot of influence with them once they get going with that. You also want to make sure, where you're going to be in the priority. If you work with a small company or a startup, you know that you're likely to be a top priority. but now you're introducing more risk because that entity has to raise money to fund everything. And don't forget, they're not just funding the patent application, they're funding probably additional translational medicine work. They may be doing additional pre-commercial work, and there's a regulatory pathway as well. And bear in mind, something can be patented and still be rejected by the FDA or the EMA. So you really are trying to serve multiple purposes when you're raising money. The patent applications alone will probably run to 6 figures just to get your first patent. And if you're going to build a patent family or try to work in multiple marketplaces, it could easily go into several $1,000,000 long before you generate your first dollar of revenue. So that actually comes back to, when do you file? Well, if you haven't filed a provisional, you're unlikely to get any investment. When you've filed one, it helps, but that's why, again, you're probably going to be looking for money before you have an issued patent. So you're going to need to be able to share the progress with a potential investor.
Thank you, Matt. All right, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about a lot about the intellectual property and it being developed inside of the academic institution. But, Matt, as you were talking about how, eventually this intellectual property is going to leave the academic institution in a form of a license, either to that startup or an established company. So, but this is kind of a big event when that occurs. So what should an academic researcher who's generated intellectual property be prepared for when their work leaves their lab and enters into the commercial sphere?
Well, before it even leaves the lab, be prepared that you're not everything you say will be accepted at face value. There's a whole process called due diligence, and that's where a corporate entity needs to identify, is there real value? And that can be a very easy process. It could be a very difficult process. But again, similar to the patent examiner, they're looking for bad. They're looking for gaps in the work that's been done. They may be looking for reproducibility. If you've proven that it works in your lab, remember, they are going to want to see if it can work in another lab as well. And so that can be a little bit of a surprise because, that's not something you often get necessarily in academia the same way. The other thing that you're going to have to expect is that the commercial interest may not be the same as your academic interest. Again, if you're looking to get tenure, you're thinking, I need to publish and I need to publish fast. The commercial company may be saying, if you publish, we lose value, and that's a violation of the license agreement. So you will not have the same level of control. And the other is, once the patent is assigned or licensed, who actually controls the filings? In our case, we work closely with Temple, but we're leading the process right now. Now, in our case, the academic Inventor is working very closely with us as an advisor to the company, and it's worked really well. But there may be times when, the company's needs will differ from the academic researcher's needs.
Thanks, Matt. You made a statement about that you're working with the academic researcher. And that's something that we do see quite a bit when you do, especially when you have a startup company, that the business team is still working with the academic researcher, but that in itself can create some complications. Carlos, I don't know if you have any comments about there, as being an academic researcher and engaging industry, some best practices, for your colleagues that are looking to enter into this space.
Yes, as Matt mentioned, there are different ways that you can interact once the intellectual property has been licensed and there is a company that has been created. One of them is to be a consultant, and then these have to be backed up with a contract that specifies what are your functions. Is going to be safe for the researcher and for the company. Or you can also get, as a researcher, you can interact with the company and try to get funding, and part of the funding can go to the academic institution. And these are different kind of SBRs or STTRs. This is another way that you can interact with the company, especially because at the beginning, all the knowledge and all the know-how was generated, and you have a better idea on how to move it forward, creating more knowledge around that. Then there are still ways that the researcher can interact with the company. One of them is applying for grants, or you can even interact with different companies that you are going to support. For, as Matt was saying, you can reproduce some different kind of experiments, and that has been like another of the experience that I have. And then in that way, the safest way is to have a contract for the consultant and they specify what are your functions and what are the limitations. Like the work that you are going to do is just like bench work, and it's not going to generate any kind of intellectual property. Then the university doesn't have anything to do with the company at that point. Then I think that's my experience on that part.
That is great, and I am going to put in a shameless plug for for a moment. So next month we actually are going to be discussing non-dilutive funding. And you mentioned SBIRs, STTRs. I mean, the federal government is the largest accelerator of startups in our country. So we'll be discussing more like how do you get those and what resources we have available in our area. So thank you, but thank you for all those comments. Pat, did you have any additional comments?
It's kind of been covered already, but my advice to researchers is first, ask yourself what you want to be. Do you want to be an academic researcher who, comes up with an invention or whatever and kind of kicks it out of the lab and lets it go on its own and let the company develop, or do you want to be involved? And then if you want to be involved, at what level? Do you want to be at, kind of an exterior advisor, or do you want a more integrated role at a company? So kind of ask yourself what you want. The other thing is go back and read your employment contract as the faculty member. Most people don't totally remember exactly what the limits are and what they can and can't do. And most academic researchers want to continue to be academic researchers, have some involvement with the startup, but they really just want to be a professor in the first instance. So go understand your academic employment contract so you're sure not to make mistakes in doing something you're not supposed to, because it's you're prevented from it based on the obligations you have to the university. You don't want to get into trouble there. So those are my pieces of advice early on, but important to do them early on.
Yeah, I'll add to that. Very often when I've seen companies run into trouble in this regard, it's because they didn't address these issues early. We're not talking about needing a contract or anything, but there should be a clear discussion of expectations and how things will work. This actually becomes a big deal for investors as well. If you are going to say, if you have a not good relationship with between the academic inventor and the company, that's going to cause problems when you're trying to get funding. And coming from the company side, if you don't have funding, you can't do anything.
And, that raises another issue I just remembered that I've seen before, and that is, if the company is funding research in your lab, you need to be careful with that as well to understand, when university resources are being used for a company's purposes. So, pay attention to those scenarios as well, because that can create problems later.
Yeah, no, I think those are excellent points. And that is something that, we face, working inside of an academic institution when we have researchers that are looking to engage, the startup company that is progressing their technology. And I would say from, the researchers out there, just engage your administration, so start with your tech transfer. Once it starts moving into a potential conflict of interest situation, we have teams that can come alongside and help, kind of navigate that road. It is all you can navigate it. We just need to have those open, communications, and Matt, I think you made some really great points too. I mean, because ultimately, as an academic institution that is spinning technology out of the institution, we want to see these startups successful. We want to see you be able to raise money and develop the technology, and it, actually in our case, a lot, being at the College of Medicine, impact patient care and improve patient care. So we're looking to be really good partners that way. So yeah, it's just having those open lines of communication. One of the questions that came in from the audience is, I think we've touched on this quite a bit here. It says, please provide examples of partnerships that lead to successful startup ventures. And I do think that, the number one partnership will be the academic institution, the researcher with the startup team that's taking the technology forward. But is there any other thoughts as far as, success, other partnerships that could lead to successful startup ventures? Who else should we be considering in this mix?
Well, it's how you define startups. If you're saying every time an academic inventor has a new idea, they must create a new company, that's not always the case. There may be companies out there, small ones, that have complementary technologies, or where there's a good relationship that you can build. So you shouldn't necessarily immediately jump to, where's my lawyer, let's form an LLC and get going. That being said, if you are going to do that, I keep repeating this, make sure you have a really good IP attorney and someone who works in the area that you work. If you're in life sciences, having someone who works in software is not the right fit. Yeah, I see Pat laughing. I'll also say, if you are good friends with a lawyer who will cut you a break, but is not an IP attorney, thank your friend and look elsewhere. This is something you can't get wrong. The other thing to bear in mind is that no one does anything by themselves. You're going to work with your investors. You're going to work, a good accounting firm, communications firms, and find the ones that are complementary, especially investors. There's a big difference between someone who can give you money and someone who can give you money and connections and very good counsel.
Thanks, Matt. Any other comments about strategic partnerships? Okay. So another question that came in, and Matt, you mentioned LLC. So the other question is how do you determine legal aspects and structure of the company? So you want to explain like LLC versus like a C Corp? Like, so what should a person think about when they're forming their company?
A few things. One is, how much money are you going to raise and how many rounds you're going to go through. The more money you're raising and the more rounds, you're probably looking more to C Corp, where it's easier to issue stock, than an LLC, where you have more of a direct ownership that's passed through. Same as, are you going to be generating revenue sooner rather than later? Because in an LLC, if you're developing a product that's going to be years of development with no revenue, those pass-throughs may be beneficial. But if you're profitable early, that could hit your taxes right away. I think the last one as well is it may depend on your investors. When I started my company, we did it as a C Corp. I've always done my companies as a C Corp. But when we were talking to the initial lead investor, they wanted it to be a priced round, one where you issue preferred stock. So I'm glad we had a C Corp because we didn't have to go through a conversion process. And if this all sounds like I'm speaking high finance, yeah, this is not an easy question. And this is where speaking to a good accountant and a good attorney who knows startups, which is probably not your IP attorney, will matter.
Thank you. Yeah, and I want to make a comment here. Matt, you've been sharing with our audience, rightfully so, a lot that they need a good IP attorney. And and I will also put in there, you need also a person like yourself who has started lots of companies, who knows the road and can guide the technology appropriately, and knows where the pitfalls are and knows when you need to outsource some really good resources. So that's something we always encourage our researchers as well, is to partner well with a good, someone with a lot of business experience. We are coming up to the end of our time here. So the one other question that we had come in says, how are college universities involved with the process of creating a startup from a student research innovation? So Brian, if you can actually move the slide forward one, and because I think this is really applicable for all of our folks. The one thing to know, when you have generated intellectual property, there is a lot of support out there for you, being inside of an academic institution, whether you're a faculty member or whether you're a student or even a postdoc. Or in our case, we have a lot of clinicians that are also generating intellectual property, but you have tech transfer offices and commercialization office that will help navigate you through this. And these offices can also connect you with folks like Pat and Matt, that you will really have the expertise. In addition, there's also academic partners that are just outside of the academic institution that can also help advance the technology as well. Brian, earlier when we were starting our program, mentioned BioStrategy partners. We have a Germinator program that really connects you with industry to move a technology through the proof of concept phase. But even like University City Science Center also has resources like this as well, in programs, funding programs. And Brian, if you would just advance one more slide. And then there's also a lot of resources within our areas for the post-startup world. So everything through programs, through Pennsylvania's DCED, for the tax credit programs, we have a lot of co-working space, like one of our sponsors, University Place Associates. But then even looking again at the Ben Franklin that works with the academic partners, also works with startups as well. So there is a lot of resources within our region to come alongside you. So I'm going to pause there, since we only have about 2 minutes left, to see if anybody has any final thoughts for our audience before we close.
Okay, I would like just to wrap up. The take-home message from the academic side is for the researchers, get a very good relationship and a close relationship at early stage with your technology transfer office to disclose any kind of research or new invention that you are considering for patenting. Then that's my best advice. You will get the advice from there, the feedback, and the guidance to move it forward. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Carlos.
Okay, I'll just add where I started. When you're looking to commercialize, remember, it's not about the level of innovation, even though some of it may be fantastic. It's about the value of the innovation. And so you'll want to work with someone, A, who can really identify that value, and B, achieve it.
Excellent point, Matt. And Pat, any closing comments for our audience?
Don't be what I call asymmetrical. A lot of inventors are brilliant in their own space, but they haven't necessarily sat down and tried to find books and articles about starting a business and read them. So read, do the homework, pretend you're going to write a grant about starting a business, so that you come into these conversations, a bit more sophisticated, and you understand. Like, honestly, I didn't realize, for example, if you look at the world, we think of the United States as so big, and all these other countries, you assume they're as big. A lot of countries are much smaller. So you think about even things like patent protection. Well, some of these countries have the GMP in New Jersey. So you have to become more sophisticated about the world and markets and the pharmaceutical business, et cetera. So commit yourself to becoming more learned about those other areas, and you'll be a much better person to work for with the businesses that are trying to invest in you.
Excellent point, Pat. Thank you. Okay, so we are past the top of the hour. So I just want to extend one last thank you to Matt, Carlos, and Pat for being our panelists today. Excellent, excellent material for our audience. So thank you. And then also one last thank you to all of our sponsors that really make the Practical Knowledge series happen. We couldn't do that without them. All right, so with that, thank you everyone, and hope to see you all next month. Take care.